So thank you everyone for joining us today for this next Spotlight lecture. It's great to welcome so many of you to the live session. And if you're watching this back as a recording, then it's great to see you there too. I'm delighted today to welcome Dr. Philip Mansell, a founding committee member of the Levantine Heritage Foundation and author of several books, particularly one on the life of Louis XIV, which forms part of today's presentation. And he is an authority on court histories and the lives of Louis XIV and the XVIII. And today he's going to be talking to us about the French in Egypt from Louis XIV to Louis XVI. So prior to Napoleon Bonaparte's invasion of Egypt in 1798. So a bit of a different approach to history than perhaps we're used to in the field of Egyptology. But of course, it's still part of Europe's great interest in Egypt and its heritage. So I'm really delighted to welcome Dr. Philip Mansell today. Thank you so much, Philip.
Thank you, Carl. I'm delighted to be with you. And I want to show how important Egypt was in French strategy and trade. And above all, next please, trade perhaps. It all begins with the French-Ottoman alliance in the 16th century between François Ier on the left and Suleiman the Magnificent on the right. They were both enemies of Austria, and François Ier wanted to promote French trade in the Ottoman Empire, and he signed capitulations which enabled Frenchmen to be in Egypt as well as other provinces of the Ottoman Empire. Next, please. And here you see an example of the articles of these frequently renewed treaties between the two countries. The leading Catholic power and the leading Muslim power were in fact allies. Next, please. Here you see the extent of the Ottoman Empire and the position of Egypt at the heart of the empire and controlling the Eastern Mediterranean and above all access to the Red Sea, which really concerned French ministers keen to promote French trade in coffee and other products coming through the Red Sea. Next, please. And here you see Louis XIV, the great king, the Sun King, and he's receiving the homage of the four continents, the four corners of the world. On the left, you see the continent of Africa. He's very conscious of the globe, the world, projecting French power, increasing French trade, and of course of Egypt, which held a special place in the memory of the French monarchy because Saint Louis, Louis IX, had been held prisoner in Dumyat. Next, please. Here he is again on a globe, one of these wonderful globes that you can see in the Bibliothèque Nationale, which has many Egyptian treasures, where there was a wonderful Champollion exhibition 2 years ago. Next, please. And here he is, here is his minister negotiating with the Ottoman ambassador. These treaties go on and they enable a French consul to be in Cairo and French Catholic missionaries of the Capuchin order also to be in Cairo, and beginning gradual conversion of local Christians, Copts or Armenians, to Catholicism. Next slide, please. And here you have a famous handbook of trade, 1675, published for Louis XIV's subjects. And here people are talking about the trade in Egypt. For example, Alexandria is not up to much now, they say. Customs rights. Cairo is the center of all the merchandise of the French. And it's above all skins, cotton, fruit, and already they're thinking of a Suez Canal. Next slide, please. And this is Marseille, the great center of trade with Egypt. It all had to go through the port of Marseille, which was protected by the French crown, and where Muslims were quite a common sight. Next slide, please. Next, please. A picture by Vernet showing Turkish merchants on the port of Marseille. Next, please. And this shows the French ambassador, Louis XIV's ambassador, he is going round the Ottoman Empire. Here he is in Athens. He's renewing the treaties and making sure the local officials know the terms that are allowing French merchants to live freely in the empire. He never got to Egypt, however, because the Grand Vizier forbade his journey there. Next, please. Next. Next. And 1683, the normal course of relations between the empire is changed by the victory of this man, King John Sobieski of Poland, over the Ottoman Empire. And the Ottoman Empire, many consider, is close to collapse. And they're beginning to look around, well, which piece should France take? And already there had been a scheme by Leibniz in 1672, Leibniz, the philosopher, saying that France should take Egypt. And I want to read you some of these remarks that he makes. The Turkish Empire is collapsing on all sides. It's natural, because of St. Louis's imprisonment in Egypt, for France to take Egypt. And everybody's urging Louis XIV to do this and to prepare a French invasion of Egypt. France should get all Egypt, and I quote, because St. Louis fought at Damietta. And next slide, please. Here is another French visitor to Egypt, Monsieur Thévenot, in 1652. He's very denigratory about Egyptians, saying they're all big cowards, lazy, and cowardly. Next slide, please. This is his travel book with much on Egypt. Could it become bigger, please? No. Next slide, please. Yes, where you see he's visiting, thank you, he's visiting Egypt as well as the rest of the Ottoman Empire. Next slide, please. And here you see one of his rather fantastic illustrations, but showing the knowledge of Egypt already quite common in Paris and Marseille. Next slide, please. And here is another account of Egypt, 1672, by Van Sleb for Louis XIV, new account of a journey made to Egypt. And the purpose of the journey, there are three main factors governing France's relations with Egypt: power, trade, and scholarship. And he was looking for coins and medals for the Bibliothèque Royale, now the Bibliothèque Nationale, which has a wonderful collection of them from Egypt. Next slide, please. And here you have a view of Constantinople, the capital. And next slide, please. And here, could these be enlarged, please? 1686, the Minister of the Navy sends a huge expedition to all around the Ottoman Empire, including Egypt. And the purpose, the hidden purpose, though many people guessed about its purpose, was to check out the ports and the cities and the entire coast and see where French ships could land and grab the territory. And I quote from the official instructions to Monsieur Gravier d'Ortière, who commissioned these drawings of Rosetta and Alexandria. His Majesty wants Monsieur d'Ortière, above all, to examine all the ports and coast of the empire and draw maps and plans and examine closely all anchorages and the entries of all harbours, their distance from the mooring places, the ports, the winds, everything in order to know how and where French ships should land. He will reconnoiter all the places along the coast that are good for making descents, how high the coast is, how deep the anchorage is, where large vessels can land, and above all, the distance of cannon from mooring places to the land. He will also examine the entry of the cities, how well they are fortified, how many openings there are in each gate, how you can approach them, and the suburbs, whether they are large or whether they're small. What their rivers, their streams. He will remark the entry of all the harbours, their extent and their depth. So this is really a spying and military mission to a friend. The Ottoman Empire was still officially the friend of France, just to check what would be easy for France to get, because France was above all concerned that Austria, whose armies were then advancing in the Balkans, would get most of the Ottoman Empire, perhaps Russia advancing from the east, and France would lose out. It wanted, in fact, its share to be Egypt, all the Greek islands, and Constantinople after burning it. It's a very brutal imperialist blueprint for destroying the Ottoman Empire. He will remark all the approaches of cities, where there is water, where there is forage, if the land is dry and stony or fertile, if it's flat or mountainous. And all these drawings are now in the archives of the Ministry of the Navy in Paris, because this was a secret mission, or relatively secret, run by the Ministry of the Navy, whereas the Ministry of Foreign Affairs was still maintaining an ambassador in Constantinople and officially friendly relations. And the final title of this extraordinary mission, which went all around the Eastern Mediterranean, is State of the places which Muslim princes have on the coast of the Mediterranean Sea, and whose plans have been drawn by order of the king after the visit of the ports of the Levant, which His Majesty ordered to be made in the years 1685, 1686, and 1687, with plans to make invasions there and make ourselves masters of them. And this is a very brutal plan. And in fact, the people of Alexandria guessed what was being cooked for them. And they threw stones at the French mission. But because France was officially the friend of the Ottoman Empire, it wasn't stopped. And I quote from the instructions, the plan was to cut all the Turks to pieces. So French imperialism was alive and well as early as the 1680s towards Egypt. But in fact, the Ottoman Empire recovered. And next slide, please. Next, please. Here you see a plan of Alexandria, one of these very careful plans, which a good naval commander, it would be enough for him to guide him to Alexandria. This is 1686. It is 112 years before the expedition of Egypt of 1798. Next slide, please. And here you see the fate of a French consul. I just put this in to remind you there was constant conflict as well as alliance. This is the French consul in Algiers, then theoretically part of the Ottoman Empire, who's being blown out of the mouth of a cannon because of disputes then going on between the rulers of Algiers and France. Next slide, please. But then calmer relations return, really because the Ottoman Empire has recovered and beaten back the forces of Austria in the Balkans, and has made peace with Austria. And France resumes its role as a center of scholarship. And here is the title page of the Voyage of Paul Lucas, who is another scholar sent by the king to Egypt to look for coins and medals and other remains. And he travels there between 1699 and 1703. And he later wrote a full account, Voyage du Sieur Paul Lucas au Levant. And it's dedicated to the king's sister-in-law, Madame Duchesse d'Orléans. I do not anymore regret the perilous exhaustion of my journey, because the accounts of some of my journeys have been able to please your Royal Highness. And she, by the way, was a famous collector of coins and medals to whom Paul Lucas gave or sold many of what he found. And he's very interested in pyramids, ancient remains. He finds Alexandria, and I quote, completely ruined except for a few houses where live a few poor people. He describes the so-called column of Pompey, how he is able to buy coins and medals, the consul's house in Cairo. The French consul was living with Capuchin monks, because Catholic French monks were officially under the protection of the King of France. He talks about the, and I quote, indecent posture of the dancing girls in Cairo and Egypt. Many accounts of the priests and the people he meets in Cairo, to whom he describes the magnificence of Versailles, accounts of pyramids, crocodiles, and again showing the importance of the Ottoman power structure in the relations between France and Egypt. His audience with the governor of Egypt in the citadel of Cairo, I quote, the entire audience was passed with great compliments from one side to the other, and coffee, exchange of perfume, sorbets, I quote, you must never go and visit Turks with empty hands if you want to be well received by them. And he also talks about Fayoum. He's observing Egyptian agriculture. All the French observers are very keen on agriculture and trade between France and Egypt. He talks about the orange trees, the apricot and peach trees, the power structure of Egypt and the governor and the Mamelukes. The government in Egypt is almost entirely aristocratic. The governor divides his power with the commanders of the militia. He talks about the temple of Isis, Cleopatra's Needle, the new town of Alexandria, which is getting larger according to him, and has many North Africans. And I quote, women are not very chaste in Egypt. He talks about pyramids and the caravan going from Cairo to Mecca. Next slide, please. This is his second volume of his book. Next slide, please. This is his map of the Delta. You see very detailed observation. He's really traveling around Egypt, always looking for coins and medals. Next slide, please. This is Pompey's column in Alexandria. Next slide, please. Cleopatra's Needle, all this published in the 1720s, long before the expedition of Egypt. Next slide, please. Rather fantasy pyramids. Next slide, please. And this is the Nilometer, which he's also observed. So you see this French traveling monk has quite good access, thanks to the French-Ottoman alliance, to different sites in Egypt. And he doesn't complain about treatment or being stoned or anything like that. He talks about commerce. He's very, very denigatory about Egyptians. Ignorant, proud, their most natural defaults are laziness and cowardice. Trade is beginning to boom. Next slide, please. Here you see his print of the Great Pyramid, which is included in his book, which sold quite well when it was published in the 1720s in France. Next slide, please. And a detail from the Temple of Isis. No, I can't quite read the next slide, please. Here is a detail from the Temple of Isis, recorded by Paul Lucas, just one of many French travelers to Egypt in the late 17th and 18th centuries. They would go by ship from Marseille to Alexandria, usually. Trade is booming. There is some building in Alexandria. The coffee trade from Yemen is beginning to boom, so there is constant concern to get access to the Red Sea. And perhaps the most interesting man I'm going to talk about today is the French consul in Alexandria from 1692 to 1708, the consul of Louis XIV, who was called Monsieur Maillet. And he wrote an early Description de l'Égypte, published in 2 volumes in 1735 in Paris. And he's already planning a canal between the Mediterranean and the Red Sea. And at his suggestion, already young Copts are being sent from Egypt to study in the Collège Louis le Grand in Paris. And partly at his instigation, because a consul then was a very independent operator, a French expedition was sent from Egypt to Ethiopia, led by the French vice-consul Lenoir du Roule. Its mission was to encourage French trade and the conversion of the Emperor of Ethiopia to Roman Catholicism. However, it was destroyed on the way on the Blue Nile in Sennar, mainly because the inhabitants were suspicious of it. And Monsieur Maillet is also interesting because he's a very early example of somebody who did not believe in the biblical account of the creation of the world. He didn't believe in Genesis. He believed the world was at least 2 billion years old, and he uses field geology and biology to back up his statements. He thought mankind came from fish. This is very daring for a consul of Louis XIV in the early 18th century. Next slide, please. This is back to Paul Lucas. This is a well in the citadel of Cairo. Next slide, please. This is the procession of the caravan about to go to Mecca, the annual caravan leaving Cairo for Mecca. So he's observing Muslim life and Egyptian life. Next slide, please. And this is the frontispiece of Monsieur Maillet's book. Next slide, please. Where you see some of the contents and how, could you make it larger, please? How he's observing different aspects of Egyptian life, Egypt in general, the River Nile, how the geography of the country, and Damietta and Rosetta, now Rushdie, the different lakes and so on. It's a very thorough description published in 1735, probably slightly Bowdlerized by the editor, so his originality was hidden. Next slide, please. And also make it larger, please. And now he's talking about Upper Egypt, the history of Egypt, the fertility of Egypt, the religion of the Egyptians, the principles, the fruit and the products of Egypt. So it's almost a trade manual, the habits of the manners and customs of the inhabitants, and so on. He's really very interested in every aspect: mummies, local monasteries, the crops, the vines, the religion, how it's governed, the different military forces, the present state of the arts and commerce in Egypt, the project to have a Suez Canal. Again, very denigrating. Egyptians nowadays are clumsy in everything. I quote, a plan to move Pompey's column to Paris. They're already planning looting antiquities. And he thought it would be easy to get permission from the Ottoman Sultan, because the Ottoman Sultan depended on the French alliance, but there would be a lot of opposition from the local population. And indeed, he did send some antiquities to Egypt to France to please Louis XIV. There is a statue of the Empress Faustina in the Louvre now, which he sent to Louis XIV in 1699. And a lot about the coffee trade, how to make sure that French commerce was better than English commerce. Next slide, please. That's his picture. There's very little is known about this completely original figure. Next slide, please. And here you see Cleopatra's Needle, Pompey's column. This is from his description of Egypt. Next slide, please. Mummies. Next slide, please. The Great Pyramid. So already these are becoming quite familiar, at least to Parisians. Next slide, please. A long description of Cairo. It's really quite readable. There should be a modern edition from the original manuscript. Next slide, please. Could you expand it, please? About the famous pyramids of Egypt, and in particular the Great Pyramid, its inside, and the secrets which it contains. And again, a long description of the pyramids. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. And here is just to show you the background to French-Egyptian relations. This is the formal reception of the Ottoman ambassador in 1742 in the Galerie des Glaces in Versailles by Louis XV. French kings came and went, but the French-Ottoman alliance continued, on which the French presence in Egypt depended. Even consuls could make their own agreements with the governor of Egypt. Again, constant plans to take antiquities like Pompey's column to Paris, one again in 1735, and the plan was to put it up in Paris with a statue of Louis XV on top. But nothing came of it, and in the 1760s, the Ottoman Empire is further declining, and it was even said that French trade in Egypt was almost finished. The Ottoman Empire is losing wars with Russia, and so again, 90 years after Louis XIV's mission of 1686, Louis XVI sends another mission to Egypt, 1777, under Baron de Tott, another naval officer, with secret instructions, oral instructions, not written down, to find ways to conquer Egypt and Beirut, because the strategic importance, particularly for trade with India, was growing. And he writes a report, Baron de Tott, which again is in the archives of the Navy Ministry, saying Alexandria, the key to Egypt, was protected, and I quote, only by a fortress with towers of a very bad construction, which the presence of one of the king's ships would compel to surrender immediately. And by then, the population was only 15,000. Next slide, please. And here you have the French foreign minister, the Comte de Vergennes, who probably may not have known of the Baron de Tot's mission to Egypt because he supported the Ottoman Empire, as is clear from his Turkish dress. This is a picture done in 1766 in Istanbul. Next slide, please. And here you see two frontispieces to French books, and on the right there is the frontispiece to Muradja Dawson's Tableau Général de l'Empire Ottoman, which is advocating the revival of Islam. So there's one French policy, this was published in 1787, is pro the Ottoman Empire and Islam, but another is not. On the left is a pro-Christian book by the Comte de Choiseul-Gouffier, who is a great patron and ambassador in Constantinople, who later sends an artist to Egypt. Next slide, please. And the artist is, anyway, there's this French plan to conquer Egypt. They really believed it would be very easy to conquer, and I quote, this is 1777, but 1784, Choiseul-Gouffier sends the great artist Louis-François Cassas round the Ottoman Empire and to Egypt. And here is one of his rather fantasizing and aggrandizing drawings of Egypt in 1784, the Sphinx and the Pyramid. Next slide, please. There it is again. Next slide, please. This is his book published in competition with the Description de l'Égypte. It's about 1800, but these are from earlier prints and drawings, 1784, showing the French fascination with Egypt was there long before Napoleon's expedition. Next slide, please. Here you see the fort at the entrance to Alexandria. This is Cassas, drawing in 1784, published as prints in a book in 1799. Next slide, please. Cleopatra's Needle in Alexandria by Cassas. Next slide, please. A fantasy view of an Egyptian temple that already very fascinated by pharaonic architecture and style. Next slide, please. An entrance to a temple. Next slide, please. The entry of the governor of Egypt into Cairo. This would be repeated every 2 or 3 years as each new governor arrived. And this was a way of displaying Ottoman sovereignty in Egypt. Next slide, please. A marriage procession in Cairo, a drawing. There are hundreds of drawings by Cassas and paintings and prints. So hopefully one day there will be a major exhibition just of this artist who went all round the Ottoman Empire in 1784 to 6 for the French ambassador, and his works were not fully published because the revolution intervened. Next slide, please. And here we come to the end. This is the Comte de Forbin in 1818. It's too much for one talk, but I hope I have shown this treble aspect of French involvement with Egypt: trade, scholarship, but perhaps above all, power, planning to grab Egypt, both under Louis XIV and under Louis XVI. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Philip. That was really interesting. And it's great to have this sort of broader awareness of Egyptology, really, and prior to the Napoleonic campaign, which I'm reflecting on the Who is Who in Egyptology publication that the Egypt Exploration Society publishes, which actually begins with the Napoleonic campaign. And I think you've given us great arguments to push that earlier and earlier.